Croeso, welcome, croeso I ddadlu nos iau, Saesneg, Gwyl, Daniel Owen. Welcome to the Thursday night English lecture in this year's Daniel Owen Festival. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this evening. Dwi'n falch iawn medru croesawu Dr Robert Lomas yma am yr ail waith. It's very nice to introduce Robert again, Dr Robert Lomas, for the second time.
Third.
Third time?
I did one in COVID online.
Oh, you did? Oh, yeah. In the COVID, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Gosh. And this is especially, my opening remarks is especially to people who are not aware of Robert's expertise in this field. Those people who attended the two, as I pointed out, previous meetings with Robert know well of his expertise. But to those who are not, if I were to introduce Dr Lomas as a retired university lecturer who has a doctorate in solid-state physics, whatever that is, a non-Welsh speaker, and a best-selling author, mainly on Masonic matters, you would be justified in asking, why is he here to talk to us on a period in the life of the first Welsh language novelist from Mold? When you know that he has deep roots, very deep roots in the area, he spent his childhood holidays in Mold and Buckley, and he inherited a copy of Rhys Lewis in the original Welsh from his nine, and he was determined to be able to read it in Salford. And the determination to read it meant that he had to translate it. He's dyslexic, by the way. He was determined to translate it, which he did, I suppose, in those days via dictionaries. So,
I still do use dictionaries.
Before Mr. Google did his translations. When you see that there's a passion for the novel and his connection with Mold and his family, evolved into a passion for the man behind the novel. So he's a very intimate and detailed knowledge of Daniel Owen as well. So in Salford he begins his another career as a translator. And also, I might add that there is a Salford connection with Daniel Owen, because Daniel Owen's sister, Catherine, went to work in the cotton mills. He, as I say, had a second career as a translator, and I hope he will, and perhaps we'll say a little bit about this at the end, and translated the first English translation of a Dreflan, which is here for you to look at and buy later. Gai gyflwyno ein siaradwr heno. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, who's going to talk about Daniel Owen's return to Mold, really, as a failed student. He won't be he wasn't the first, and he won't be the last to come back home in that guise. So Daniel Owen back home and writing his first, I suppose, successful novel. But anyway, Robert can tell us about, which he's entitled The Secret Flowering of Skill and Genius. To Robert Lomas.
Noswaith dda gobeithio. Croesio y naiad syri ryddion y wyddgrig, y gŵl Daniel Owen. Rwy'n falch iawn y gael, yn wahad yn ôl unwaith eto. Y bahau am storio o sut y llwydol Daniel I datblygau isgriau ysgrifennu ar ôl ydyd y dael coleg y bala. Ydy coleg y wyddgrig, wrth gyf fathau y dreflan, ac wrth edrwg eran henes cyroedyd, dagan fwthaias lawer y bethan newid difarot. A byddai yn irannau gyda chi heno. Nine would be proud of me. But I'll now repeat that in English so everybody can understand it. Good evening. Welcome to Mold Masonic Hall and the Daniel Owen Festival. I'm delighted to be invited back once more to continue my story of how Daniel managed to develop his writing skills after he dropped out of Bala College and returned to Mold. And this evening I want to talk to you about the very first novel Daniel Owen wrote. It was called a Dreflin, and that means the Township. This is the third in a series of lectures I have written and presented at biannual intervals for the Daniel Owen Festival. 2 years ago, I left the story at the point where Daniel had suffered a serious pulmonary embolism, which had damaged both his health and his confidence. This evening, I want to consider some further questions I have had about Daniel, which have puzzled me whilst I was translating a Drevlin. When I retired from Bradford University, I suddenly had more spare time and less academic pressure. So for my own interest and amusement, I decided to translate Daniel's lesser-known writings, so I could read them for myself. As I am a dyslexic quantum physicist, translation is a slow technical process for me. I was taught interpreting as an undergraduate and was examined on my ability to translate Russian technical papers. With more spare time, I decided to apply this technical dictionary-orientated technique to Daniel Owen's Victorian Welsh. I started by translating the privately published subscription edition of Rhys Lewis, which was printed by John Lloyd Morris when he owned the premises which are now Shop Assistant. I found this self-imposed task extremely satisfying, and during my enhanced need for home amusement during the isolation of the COVID lockdown, I went on to translate 10 Nights in the Black Lion. During this undertaking, I came across various academic issues about the erratic timing of the production of the episodes, along with questions about whether Daniel had actually written some of the latter and stranger episodes. Whilst trying to understand this situation, I undertook an extensive study of the events in Daniel's life at the time of the publication, along with a statistical analysis of his local Welsh vernacular vocabulary. In the lecture I gave for the 2020 festival, which was entitled How Daniel Became a Writer, I was able to prove beyond all reasonable statistical doubt that Daniel did write all the episodes of 10 Nights. During that period, I started to develop a detailed timeline of all the documented events in Daniel's life and was able to account for many of the erratic timings of his episodes in the light of what was happening in his private life. Creating a time tag database of events and dates gave me a considerable insight into what Daniel was doing and with whom. By cross-referencing all this material in the database, I was able to gain more insight into his possible motives. Since then, I've continued to translate Daniel's lesser-known works. I've produced English versions of his 7 sermons and his Methodist Characters of Mold. During that process, I added a lot more information about Daniel's life and activities into my expanding database. I began to see that the reality of Daniel's life was far more interesting and complex than the simple myths about him that I had heard as a child. But I had not yet addressed one of the remaining great mysteries of Daniel Owen's development as a writer and a man. I knew of a Drevlin. Indeed, I owned a Hughes & Son illustrated first edition with a delightful line drawing of Mold High Street on the cover. But that book contained 86,000 words of Victorian Mold dialect Welsh, which I would have to translate before I could understand it. For the last 2 years, I've been working on translating a Drevlin, and I finished it in time to launch it at the 2024 festival. Now I want to tell you what I learnt about Daniel during this exercise. A Drevlin offered me a deeper viewpoint into the development and intention of Daniel's writing. It gave me more insight into the nature of the issues he had with his faith and his expectations about preachers and their flocks. It also shone a light on his politics and personal concerns, whilst highlighting some shortcomings of plot resolution which had characterised the unsatisfactory conclusion of 10 Nights in the Black Lion. So this evening, I want to consider 3 questions. The first one, what were the circumstances following Daniel's return to Mold, and how did they affect his development as a writer? Secondly, how did his enthusiasm for lay preaching impact on his crisis of faith, and what effect did the devastating pulmonary embolism he suffered have on his self-confidence and ambitions in this direction? Thirdly, what role did the Reverend Roger Edwards play in rebuilding Daniel's confidence and encouraging him to develop his skills in business, politics, and writing? Let me start by looking at the practical consequences of Daniel's crisis of faith, which I have come to believe was the main reason he quit Bala College. I explained in my 2022 lecture that his exam results showed he was struggling with most of the academic subjects, which were new to him, and just holding his own in the theological topics. He certainly worked hard and tried to learn, but he was struggling with a personal crisis of belief. He had hoped that enrolling on a formal academic course to ordination would encourage the Holy Spirit to visit him and confirm his vocation. But his sermons show that this didn't happen. Luckily, when his brother David wrote to say that his sister-in-law Charlotte was pregnant and David would struggle to provide for his own expanding family as well as for their mother and sister, it gave Daniel a valid reason to abandon academia to return to his tailor's bench in Mold. He arrived back on Christmas Eve, Tuesday the 24th of December, 1867. But before he went back home to Mesa Dre, he rushed to Angel Jones to ask for his job back at the cutting table. The Reverend John Owen, in his biography of Daniel Owen, said that Daniel didn't explain the reasons for his departure to Dr. Lewis Edwards, the principal of Bala, or any of his friends or tutors. The explanation Reverend Owen offered for Daniel's silence was his independence of spirit and a reluctance to ask for help. Daniel went straight from the station to the shop of his old master's son. The day after his return, he went to the Christmas Day service at Bethesda in the company of his family and his newly reinstated employer, and stayed on for the Command-Vagani and Eisteddfod. The proceedings were conducted by the Reverend Roger Edwards, who was an ordained minister but was earning his living as an editor for the Holywell publishers P.M. Evans Limited. Edwards was a volunteer preacher at Bethesda Chapel, which was run by its elders, and had chosen not to employ a stipended minister. How much Daniel told the Reverend Edwards is not recorded, but Edwards had to be aware of the intense academic pressure of Bala's ordination course, and he didn't criticise Daniel for abandoning that hard-won educational opportunity. He welcomed him warmly back into the community. As a member of the examination board at Bala College, Roger Edwards had privileged insight into Daniel's academic struggles. He'd seen the raw exam results, attended the examiners' meetings, and marked some of Daniel's papers. He knew that Daniel was not coping well with the non-Welsh academic work, and that only by opting to answer in Welsh was he managing to cope with the theological subjects. The Reverend Edwards clearly recognised that Daniel was well capable of writing worthwhile sermons in Welsh, so he might still have a future as a lay preacher. I discussed the detail of Daniel's reasons for returning to Mold in the 2022 lecture, where I also published my translation of the 7 sermons, which he went on to deliver far and wide soon after his return to Mold. He still had hopes of becoming a preacher, but in this talk I want to look at the secular events in Mold while Daniel was adjusting to his changes in circumstances. At that Christmas Day service, Mrs. Edwards invited Daniel to attend a fundraising knife and fork party in Bethesda on Monday the 30th December. It was to be given by her and Mrs. Hugh Jones. The congregation had yet to pay off £1,000 extending balance, which had earned Bethesda the name of Capel Mawr, the Big Chapel, as following the rebuild it was able to seat 890 worshippers. Roger Edwards had put forward a 3-year plan to clear the debt and he had two objectives for the tea party. The first was to reward all the chapel members who had contributed to the successful annual Cymanfaganian Eisteddfod, held after the service on Christmas Day, as the events had filled even Capel Mawr. The second was to talk about his future fundraising plans and encourage regular giving from the congregation to clear the outstanding amount. Daniel quickly settled back into the warm masculine companionship of the group of gossipy tailors, often known locally as the Parliament of Mold, and they met in Angel Jones's workshop. The workshop was situated on the second floor of a separate building behind the shop, which was on the High Street. But Daniel Owen regretted he wasn't able to renew his acquaintance with the local bard, Glenallen. For many years, Roger Edwards had been running regular meetings to stimulate the poetic and literary skills of the young men of the town. Their year's work culminated in an annual Christmas Eisteddfod, where prizes were awarded and funds raised for the chapel. In this way, Reverend Edwards had fostered a scholarly atmosphere in the town and inspired many young men with a literary spirit. The Reverend Thomas Jones, whose bardic name was Glenallen, was a regular patron of that meeting and an adjudicator of the competitions until his death on the 29th of March, 1866. He died while Daniel was away at Bala College. Despite his poetic skills, Glenallen was never a good provider for his family. Daniel, as an indentured tailor, had been taught the skills of a practical businessman, and he said of the bard, Glenallen knew well how to spend money, but he had no understanding about how to make it. He was always living in a garret or a cellar. Yet Glen could sit down in the middle of the deafening noise of his children and write poetry or a fragment of an article for a newspaper. Glenallen's wife, Matilda, had died in 1856, leaving him with 6 small children. After trying his hand at various employments, such as candle making, he eventually made good by applying his oratory skills to becoming a commercial traveller. With a secular income, he was able to resume preaching and public speaking and continue as a zealous Eisteddfodder. When Daniel left for Bala, Glenallen was getting by. But when he died, he left his family destitute. In June 1868, Daniel joined with the other old friends of Glenallen to organise a fundraising testimonial concert for the poet's 2 youngest children, who had been left penniless on the death of their father. Roger Edwards took on the role of treasurer of the testimonial, and Andrew J. Berson, bardic name Andreas Avon, a successful local brewer and amateur poet who would later become a founder member of Sir Watkin Lodge, became its secretary. In this way, all the aspects of the messy life of the late lively preacher were well represented. Daniel shared a fond recollection of watching the great poet at work, writing, I have a memory of when I went to his house one noon and saw his housekeeper on her knees cleaning the floor, while 2 of his children and 2 of their friends were playing a noisy game. Glen was sitting in a chair with 2 arms, with a table in front of him, and he was composing Preacher of the People, as if no one else was in the room but himself. Although the world diminished and defeated him, his muse stayed strong. Each fragment of his work came from his heart and was appropriate to the occasion and its history, and he was always interesting. The testimonial was a financial and artistic success, and the children were duly grateful. It gave Daniel a chance to show his skills for public service. Daniel had by now become a contributor to the short-lived Mole and Denby Chronicle, where he wrote a column entitled Jottings from Mold, under the pen name Winfrid Fluid, a name which implies grey and boring. The column was political, not religious. He was very concerned about the failure of the town council to repair the rutted roads, to stop the ongoing pollution of the River Allen by leaks of paraffin, and improve the filthy state of the open ditch which drained the effluent from the soil closets behind Misadre. Daniel also became a regular Sunday school teacher, The Wrexham Advertiser for the 19th of September 1868 reports on a Sunday school tea party held by the Calvinistic Methodists, which he organised. Children from 3 Sunday schools in Capelmauer, Pentrey and Mysedray were invited to the market hall, where tables were set up to give them all a meal. After eating, they were taken up to the Bailey Hill to run around and play, before giving bags of nuts as a picnic treat. At 7 p.m, the children all came back to the hall to listen to speeches and to join in songs. Daniel was one of the speakers, alongside his friend Ellis Edwards, who was the son of Roger Edwards. The Advertiser reported that they spoke, urging setting up a clothing club for the poor children of the town. But there were other serious matters afoot in the town. Early in 1869, a dispute began concerning John Young, the English manager of Leeswood Green Colliery, who had brought in miners from Durham and cut the wages of the local Welshmen. On the 19th of May, some 60 miners, led by Ishmael Jones, congregated at the manager's house, and the troubles began. The displacers confronted Mr. Young. He scuttled away to hide in the winding engine house. The crowd then swelled to more than 500, and they broke into the engine house and took Mr. Young prisoner. The miners decided to send Young back to his hometown of Durham, a procedure known as sending him packing. They dragged him from the pit, frog-marched him through the villages of Pontybodkin and Pontplythin towards the station at Hope Junction. But 2 police constables had gone ahead to the station to rescue Young. They took him to Mold police station and put him in protective custody, and the mob dispersed. On the 21st of May, a new throng of angry miners descended on Leeswood to ransack Young's house and carry his furniture to the railway station at Mold to implement his intended exile. William Hughes, a ringleader, was arrested and charged with taking part in the previous attack on Young. He was taken to Mold police station and thrown in the cells. The following day, Hughes was taken by 4 policemen to Mold Courthouse on Chester Street. However, the colliers had heard what was happening, and around 1,500 arrived from Leeswood, Broncoed, Coed Talon, Trythin, Nurquis, Brumbo, Mold and Buckley Pits to block the way to the court. They were armed with stout oak sticks, pick handles and truncheons of the most formidable nature. They charged the police, who retreated, and then handed over William Hughes to the mob. The colliers carried him shoulder high through King Street, down the High Street, past the tailor's workshop where Daniel was working, and along Wrexham Street to the sound of cheering crowds. However, once the triumphal procession dispersed, Hughes opted to sneak back to voluntarily appear before the magistrate. He was bailed to return for trial on Wednesday the 2nd of June. The court then issued warrants for suspected rioting to 7 other miners. This group gave themselves up en masse after a Calvinistic lay preacher persuaded them that such an action would give them a better chance of achieving a fair outcome. That preacher's name was David Phillips, and he was a local miner from Caerblithen Pit. Prior to the great Calvinistic Methodist revival of 1859, he'd been a popular prize fighter. The defendants were also bailed to appear on the 2nd of June. On the 2nd of June, some 600 colliers from the surrounding coalfields gathered peacefully on the Hall Field in Mold. This was a massive show of support for the defendants. The court sat at 11 a.m, but took 5 hours to decide the matter and pass sentence. During the afternoon, the crowd on the Hall Field swelled to over 2,000 people. David Phillips and other local Methodists spoke to urge forbearance and restraint. It was a convivial atmosphere during their speeches, with family groups enjoying the day out. But on the sidelines, a few miners carrying cudgels and sticks were loitering near the courthouse in Chester Street. At 5 o'clock, the presiding judge handed down heavy fines to 6 of the defendants, including William Hughes, then condemned Ishmael and John Jones to a month's hard labour each. The judge's summing up had a distinctly anti-Welsh flavour. The crowd were angry at the harshness of the sentences and were further enraged when they heard about the judge's anti-Welsh sentiments. The nationalist emotions were thoroughly aroused, and by the time Ishmael and John Jones came out of the courthouse at 7 p.m, 39 Flintshire policemen and 56 soldiers had been summoned in anticipation of violence. The soldiers were from the 2nd Battalion, own regiment based in Chester, and were commanded by Captain Blake. They quickly became the focus of the miners' nationalistic fury. The prisoners were taken from the courthouse to the railway station via Chester Street and past the church on Tythen Street towards the railway station. The escort had to force their way through a large crowd of what were described as demonstrative and hustling groups of sturdy collier youths and men, including many women. The troops in their red uniforms, plumed shako bonnets, encircled the prisoners to stop their escape as they pushed through the crowd towards the platform. But as the detachment approached the railway station boundary, they found the main gate locked. Their only way in was through a narrow pedestrian gate. As the troops formed a protective cordon around that entrance, the crowd surged onto the high ground of Tythen Street and turned nasty. They began to bombard the police with cobblestones. There was a large supply of cobblestones. Tythen Street had just been recobbled to improve access to a newly built extension church for Bethesda Chapel, which was then known as the New English Presbyterian Church. Its purpose was to provide a chapel for English-speaking Calvinists. The women were set to prizing up cobbles and passing them to the men to throw down at the English troops. Peter Brown, the chief constable, later told an inquiry, "The stones were as thick as hail. The air was black with them. Many of the stones were 4 and 5 pounds in weight. Several of my own men were bleeding copiously, the blood streaming down their uniforms. The troops protecting the railway station fared no better, with missiles shattering the carriage windows of the waiting train and falling with destructive force on the knapsacks and shakos of the soldiers and the helmets of the police. 2 officers, 20 soldiers and 12 policemen were severely injured. The situation was getting desperate, so the chief constable asked Captain Blake to fire above the crowd. Blake refused, because the Riot Act had not been read, so firing on the crowd would be illegal. The chief constable then spotted a local magistrate, Mr. Clough, sitting in the train. He rushed up to him and said, "For God's sake, give the order to fire, or we shall all be murdered." In the confusion, Justice of the Peace Clough didn't formally read the Riot Act, but he did call out "Fire!" to Captain Blake. Still, Blake hesitated to shoot unarmed civilians and told his troops to hold their fire. At that point, the colliers forced the main gate and stormed the railway platform, and Blake then ordered his troops to fire. Some 15 rounds were fired. Seeing people collapsing when shot, the rioters retreated in disarray. Many police and military personnel were injured, but none died. But 4 civilians were killed. They were Edward Bellis, a 22-year-old blacksmith from Trythen. He was shot in the stomach and carried back to Bonplythen, where he died of his wounds the following morning. Robert Hannaby, a collier from Wrexham, who was shot in the face. His brains were blown out of the back of his head and were splattered onto the remaining cobblestones of Tythen Street as he died. Elizabeth Jones, a collier's wife, aged 50 years, from Coed Talon, was shot in the back and died at the scene while she was prizing up cobbles. But from Daniel's point of view, the most significant victim was an innocent teenage girl who had been cleaning the church. Hearing the commotion, she stepped onto the porch to see what was happening and was shot in the chest. The bullet went right through her and ricocheted off the stonework of the porch surround. That pockmark of the past stands testimony still to the fatal impact on that day. She died 3 days later. The young woman's name was Margaret Younghusband, and she was just 19 years old. Daniel knew her well, as she was employed as a maid in the household of the Reverend Roger Edwards, which he visited. The injustice of this whole incident was burned into Daniel's memory, and many years later he fictionalised the horror of his recollections to good dramatic effect in the plot of Rhys Lewis. To crack down hard on the insurrection, the presiding magistrate called on the army to seize the town of Mold. A company of over 100 soldiers from Chester Barrack were billeted in the market hall, with their officers accommodated in the Black Lion. They occupied the town for nearly 2 weeks, until the magistrate decided that a degree of calm had returned. And whilst he grieved for the loss of Margaret Young's husband's innocent young life, he couldn't have avoided seeing the impact of martial law on his township. Although the troops enforced a false peace, the dispute was quietly simmering on. A week or so later, John Young went back to Leeswood Green Colliery. The miners immediately walked out on strike. That strike dragged on, with the colliers becoming increasingly frustrated with Young's anti-Welsh management style. Finally, on the 22nd of July, they abducted Young again, and this time marched him to Queensferry to force him onto the train back to Durham. Again, preacher David Phillips intervened and tried to avoid violence. He even threatened the use of his dormant prize-fighting skills to protect Mr. Young from physical harm if need be. But despite his good intentions, Phillips was arrested when the police intervened. 2 trials took place at Mold Assizes on the 6th of August 1869, and they lasted for 3.5 days. One was about the riots of the 2nd of June, the other was for the attempt to send John Young packing on the 22nd of July. During the trial of the 10 men arrested for the riot of the 2nd of June, 6 were positively identified, found guilty, and sentenced to 10 years penal servitude. 4 others were acquitted for lack of evidence. In the trial for the second kidnapping of John Young, 3 men were tried and found guilty. Despite having tried to protect Young, David Phillips received the longest sentence. His fellow accused were sentenced to 3 months hard labour, while Phillips got 18 months of the same. By this time, many Leeswood colliers were reduced to begging on the streets and were enraged by the anti-Welsh bias shown by the jury that delivered the guilty verdicts. Drawn from the local gentry, it included 4 English coal mining landlords, with no one challenging their conflicts of interest. To place a cherry on top of this cake of oppressive violence that Daniel watched unfolding in his township, the convicts were removed to the station in chains and escorted by a platoon of mounted cavalry brandishing drawn swords. It was obvious to Daniel's social conscience and his tradesman's common sense that the traditional Welsh method of individual miners withdrawing their labour was ineffective for resolving industrial disputes, and things would need to change. This presented Daniel with yet another religious dilemma. In 1832, Elder John Elias had convinced the Calvinistic Methodist Connection to rule that nobody could be a church member if he was also a member of a trade union. This was complicated by the fact that Daniel's mentor, Roger Edwards, had long been committed to promoting the welfare of the workers. Edwards had been ordained in 1842. Although he took on the unpaid duties of ministering to the Bethesda congregation, he earned his living as an editor for various local publishers and had edited political journals which spoke out about the plight of the miners. He was not formally appointed pastor to Bethesda and paid a stipend until 1878. The end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century was the time of the French Revolution, and the Calvinistic nonconformists were accused of trying to arouse the people. So early leaders such as Thomas Charles had gone out of their way to prove their loyalty to the monarchy and to the Parliament. Following the Mold riots, politically radical leaders began to emerge from among the Methodists to support the Liberal Party. At the end of July 1869, a meeting had been held in Manchester to launch the Amalgamated Association of Miners. One of the speakers was Robert Lewis, a native of Mold, who was working as a miner in Wigan. On the 16th of August, Lewis returned to Mold to hold a meeting in Glanarvon to encourage the local miners to join with the Manchester Conference. Daniel attended that meeting and listened with interest to what Lewis had to say. The downtrodden Leeswood colliers were persuaded to turn to England for aid and protection and join the newly formed Amalgamated Association of Miners, the AAM. I can't help wondering if that speech by Robert Lewis inspired Daniel to name Rhys Lewis's fictional brother, Bob. Daniel was taking an active interest in the welfare of the local miners' children and helping Roger Edwards to support them. In February 1870, Daniel called a meeting to set up that clothing club, linked to the Massadrake Sunday School to help clothe the ragged poor. He also supported a reading group in the town. Since his return from Bala, he had spent many evenings practicing to improve his writing skills, whilst honing his expertise as a tailor during the working day. At his reading group, the works of the main English novelists were read aloud and discussed. They read the novels of Sir Walter Scott, as well as the works of Charles Dickens, along with Thackeray and George Eliot novels. Daniel also read a lot on his own account, so he was prepared to lead a reading class on Thursday nights in the chapel. This demanded a lot of detailed preparation, and he became a proficient and fast reader of English. Daniel befriended a journalist who came to the reading group. This man, named John Morgan, wrote for the County Herald, and Daniel was impressed that he had an official pseudonym. In the press, John Morgan was bylined as Rambler. Morgan wrote about that reading group at Bethesda, saying, "I remember well the first time I met my friend Daniel Owen at a penny readings meeting held in the British School towards the end of 1869. We both figured on the agenda of that meeting, I with the report and him with the talk." At that meeting, Daniel grumbled to Morgan that the social reporter on the Mold and Denby Chronicle, although excellent at shorthand and taking minutes of speeches, was not much good at writing descriptive pieces about the orators. Rambler suggested that Daniel write his own descriptive piece about some local character and submit it to the editor. Daniel quickly wrote a satirical portrait of one of the town's characters, Mr. Edward Williams, who was known locally as Ned Scipion. He hoped this piece would be the first in a series. Daniel wrote it in English using the pen name Gomer. This pen name is the Hebrew term for 10 bushels of grain, carrying the import of plenty. Daniel became involved in parliamentary politics. He spoke at a public meeting held in the town hall to support the campaign to elect local Liberal candidate Sir Robert Cunliffe at the forthcoming general election. Daniel addressed the meeting on behalf of the constituency's employees, shop workers, labourers and miners. He spoke eloquently of the relationship between the different classes and described their obligations towards each other. The Mold and Denby Chronicle said of his speech, "Mr. Owen had prepared an excellent talk and showed self-confidence with great authority. The common feeling was that he had made the night his own, speaking as a powerful orator from the stage." Flushed with Gomer's success, Daniel decided to tackle a religious subject. He chose Elder John Davis from Nurquist. This man had worked alongside Angel Jones to run Bethesda Chapel, and he'd also baptised Daniel Owen. He submitted Gomer's piece to Salva a Plant, the Children's Treasury, a national magazine of the Calvinistic Methodists. Well, it was one thing to apply his developing sartorial talents to one of the town's innocents, but quite another to mock one of the stalwarts of his denomination in its own national magazine, even though he didn't name Davis. In one paragraph, he said, "As a preacher, he cannot be ranked among the first class, nor among any other class, because he forms a class in himself. He is not like anyone. He is not gifted or articulate. In fact, he has a shortage of words. Despite that, he is popular in his own way, and there is no one better known than him throughout South and North Wales." Everybody recognised his subject, and many also recognised Gomer. The strong reaction that Daniel got to this article made him realise just how dangerous and powerful words can be, and how they may easily be misinterpreted. He said he had only intended to praise the unique aspects of Davis's character without resorting to the usual cheap flattery. Well, he avoided flattery, and the focus of his sketch was generally positive. But his readership felt he was defying the conventions of current biographical writing. They didn't like it, and many told him so. Chastened but not deterred, Daniel took on a key role in promoting the town, acting as secretary for the 1873 Mold Masonic. That event was a major success, and around this time his employer, Angel Jones the Younger, decided to retire and close his shop on the High Street. Daniel took on more responsibility by teaming up with James Lloyd to set up a new tailor's shop on New Street, trading under the name of Owen and Lloyd's Tailors and Drapers. Daniel's reputation as a man of importance and substance in the town was increasing. Despite Gomer's over-enthusiastic satire, Daniel was growing into a well-liked and popular lay preacher who spent his weekends travelling to take up invitations to speak from many different pulpits as far afield as Salford and Liverpool. He was a strong supporter of the chapel's education and charitable programs, a published political and religious commentator under his pen names Wilfrid Llwyd and Gomer, a published poet under his bardic name of Glaslyn, as well as being the joint proprietor of his own tailoring business. Life was looking good for the college dropout who seemed to have overcome his crisis of religious faith and thrived amid the civic life of Mold. Then he suffered a dreadful setback. Daniel preached at Rehoboth Calvinistic Methodist Chapel in Llangollen in March 1876. After the service, he went for a walk up the steep hillside of Dinas Bran prior to setting off back to Mold. He slipped and fell heavily on his back. Although he felt bruised and shaken, he thought nothing more of it and rode home. The following day, whilst working, had a dreadful surprise. This is how the Reverend John Owen described the event. While lifting a roll of cloth in the shop, Daniel slipped and pulled a blood vessel in his lungs. He lost a lot of blood and was afraid of his life for a long time afterwards. Prayers were offered on his behalf at the chapel. Although his life was saved, his strength was greatly weakened. His illness stole his spirit, and he wore an old man's face, although he was not yet 40 years old. Daniel had suffered a pulmonary embolism, a massive bleed within his lungs resulting from a burst blood vessel, and at that time they were often fatal. He was lucky to be treated by a doctor from Chester who saved his life. After he recovered, Daniel said of this time, "In March 1876, a blood vessel low in my lungs burst 3 times in a fortnight. No one thought that I would live, and I was poorly for many years afterwards. Dr. John Roberts of Chester was very careful of me at that time and nursed me very well." Daniel was never the same again. He lost his confidence and felt that God had sent him a sign to confirm he was not meant to be one of the elect and should know his place. It was many years before he regained enough confidence to speak in public again. He stopped preaching and turned his attention to writing, with outstanding results, and when well enough, returned to tailoring. The traumatic symptoms of the pulmonary embolism, which saw him effectively drowning in his own blood as it welled up from his lungs, had a profound effect on Daniel. He was unable to work and relied on James Lloyd to run their partnerships. For a couple of months it was touch and go if he would survive at all. Dr. Roberts prescribed bed rest, followed by a gentle and lengthy convalescence. His mother and sister Leah were devoted nurses, who were guided in their administrations by the treatment plan of Dr. Roberts. Roberts understood that blood vessel rupture must be given every opportunity to heal, whilst avoiding putting further stress on Daniel's lungs and cardiovascular system. This period of all-consuming helplessness gave Daniel much spare time to reflect and consider, but did nothing to restore his self-confidence. However, the treatment worked, and some 3 months later, Daniel had recovered enough to venture out. He spent that summer in Bangor as a Coed, near Wrexham, where he stayed with Mr. Evans, who was Clerk of the Peace. He spent 2 months under what he called the gentle care of Mrs. Evans, and his strength started to return. But he lived in constant fear of a relapse, and this fear often left him depressed. During his stay at Bangor as a Coed, he was often visited by Roger Edwards, who took the opportunity to encourage Daniel to write again. He suggested that Daniel write down the popular sermons he had been giving to create a small book. A first edition was published by P.M. Evans, for whom Roger Edwards worked as an editor, and it was called Offerings from Solitude. By now, Daniel had recovered sufficient strength to be able to walk down the town from Miser Dre to his shop in New Street and do some light tailoring work. He was encouraged to go to Bethesda Chapel to listen to the Reverend Edward Matthews preach. With the assistance of his friends, he was helped to the big seat under the pulpit to hear the sermon. But this meant he was facing the congregation. They were naturally more interested in Daniel than the visiting preacher. Their attention proved too much for his fragile mental state. He became so distressed that he had to retire to the vestry to listen to Reverend Matthews from behind its open door. For many years afterwards, he was afraid to speak in public or even appear before any large congregation. That was when he first took to sitting at the back of the chapel near the door, where his memorial plaque is now situated. There's a major clue about how Daniel interpreted his misfortune, as he took it as a sign from God. When two young men asked on how to become ministers, long after he had recovered, he told them, "Be sure that you know your place and that you truly feel that you have been called to preach. If you have, it's the highest calling of all. But if you don't feel the full conviction of this call, free of your own abuses, you will be placed in the unhealthiest state of all." I've already mentioned that as part of Daniel's rehabilitation while he was convalescing, Roger Edwards had encouraged him to develop his writing skills by committing his 7 sermons to paper. This writing project began his convalescent rehabilitation and went into a book which was printed in various book forms and editions, and that he advertised and sold through the post once he returned to work. But Edwards encouraged Daniel to do more than write sermons. He urged him to return to the idea of Gomer's character sketches and expand them. These essays were to be published as occasional articles for a dressova. For this venture, Daniel invented himself another pseudonym, which was a set of initials LNM. Between May 1878 and December 1878, LNM published 6 sketches, which I've already translated as Methodist Characters of Mold. These were a series of character sketches of individuals who had impressed Daniel enough for him to immortalise them in print. The readers of a dressova believed that they were traditional biographies of actual individuals. They weren't. They were composite fictional impressions of behaviour patterns and attitudes which Daniel observed and either admired or disliked. To become a successful tailor needs more than the ability to cut cloth and sew seams. It requires deep and careful observation of the frame and character of the individual who comes to be fitted for a suit. It involves careful measurement of the key dimensions of the customer's physique and careful interrogation to uncover his needs and expectations of the finished clothing. Daniel already had a formidable reputation as a good cutter of suits, which fitted well. That was why he had found it so easy to return to his old job with Angel Jones Jr. But his tailoring talent owed much more to these powers of observation than his well-honed skill with the scissors. He designed his patterns to meet the customer's anticipations and hang well on him, so making him a satisfied client. In his first character sketches for a dressova, Daniel distilled a range of such observations into composite characters which his readers identified with. This was an innovative and bold move at the time. Most Calvinists strongly disapproved of writing frivolous fiction, considering it to be a sophisticated form of lying. To have published the sketches as fiction would have resulted in them being shunned. So L&M's prose was presented as observations of real characters disguised by false names. Daniel was building on the lessons that Gomer had learned from his amusing satires about Ned Scipion, while avoiding the potential pitfalls of misunderstanding from his misguided attempts to mock a much-loved elder. Roger Edwards was so pleased with the reception of the essays that he commissioned L&M to write a continuous series of sketches in a regular column. Edwards had copied the practice of Charles Dickens of writing a novel as a serial with monthly instalments, but had disguised them as local reports. This worked for L&M. They appeared in a section of Dressova entitled Memoirs, with the first in January 1879. Edwards called the sequence of articles The Township, Its People and Their Things of the Spirit. It began with a passionate appeal to the readers to take seriously the little community in North Wales where the author lived, saying, "Dear reader, I wouldn't like you to think that our township is a worthless, deprived and destitute village. If that were so, I wouldn't want to write about it and you wouldn't want to read it. We have 7,000 souls in our township. However, incomers from Liverpool or Manchester say they are coming down to the country and they return up to town. When I hear them speak so, it annoys me, but if they knew how I felt about my town, I suspect they would be kinder in their assessment." Thus began a saga of 25 instalments chronicling the unnamed township, its people, their characters, their hopes, their fears, their sufferings and their triumphs, all apparently chronicled by the young inhabitant known only by his initials LNM. The God-fearing Methodists of that time strongly opposed promoting religious truths through fictional accounts. If Edwards had described this regular column as a novel in monthly instalments after the style of Mr. Dickens, it would have been condemned outright. By building on L&M's track record for writing popular character sketches of local Methodists, however, he was able to attract readers to the monthly column. Adrevlan was an ambitious venture. As the episodes grew month by month, they gained widespread attention and high praise, even from the conservative readership of Petrosova. But they still managed to attract criticism. As editor Roger Edwards reported, I received a serious letter in which a church secretary said he believed that the characters portrayed in the township were taken from the parish in which he lived, and that the anonymous author was trying to demonize one of the most moral and religious communities in our country. Consequently, he said the author's work was libelous junk about his parish, and he was dismayed that all the country were reading and believing it. As I read this grim letter, I couldn't help but think of Solomon's words, "As water reflects his face, so one's life reflects the heart of a man." I could only conclude that the township must illustrate principles and feelings that are common to all mankind throughout the world and the church. It wasn't until August 1881 that Edwards revealed that the township was not a factual memoir, but a work of complete fiction. The pen name L&M belonged to none other than the sickly tailor who had dropped out of theological college, taken up part-time preaching, and then been struck down by a burst blood vessel, which had nearly killed him. As Edwards explained, he had encouraged that tailor to write the initial character sketches, and as they were successful, the writing became the means of cultivating his talents, especially as his physical infirmity had forced him to give up for a time the public work of preaching where he was so useful and commendable. His success with writing encouraged him to go forward and write more. In this manner, he has shown he has much talent and skill, said Dr. Edwards. Once the series was complete, Edwards, working for P.M. Evans, published it in book form under Daniel's own name. So Daniel Owen's Adrevlan became his first novel. As Roger Edwards again said, now, with the generous encouragement of the author's friends and with the publisher's willingness, all the episodes come together in one book. This will be a benefit to those who saw the work as it unfolded, and for others who can now read it for the first time put all together. So what does the township tell us about Daniel's intentions, about his moralistic fiction? He's obviously taken to heart two clear lessons from his earlier ventures about character sketching. The first is that to know the power of words. If they are chosen well, they elicit a positive response, as he saw from his comical portrait of Ned Cyprian. But no matter how well intentioned, if they are carelessly applied, they can cause great harm. The negative response to his satirical tribute to Don Davis had shown him this. He'd also learned that creations of composite characters to illustrate moral tales could be well received. He'd been trained by Angel Jones and his fellow tailors in the Parliament of Mold to look carefully at the needs and wants of customers, and learned how to balance what they said they wanted against what would best satisfy their needs, and he then cut their cloth accordingly. Now he decided to use these skills to craft characters that his readers could identify with and use them to demonstrate the moral links between actions and consequences. The unfortunate events surrounding his first venture into fiction writing in translating 10 Nights in the Black Lion for Nathaniel Jones some 19 years earlier had firmly imprinted on his mind that a story had to have a logical ending to tie up all the loose ends. But this artistry of plotlining was a skill he never quite mastered. His first lessons in plotlining had come from Timothy Shea Arthur, the original author of 10 Nights in a Bar. And Arthur wasn't imaginative and ended stories using a device modern authors call invoking the ghost in the machine. That's when a superior character, like a god descending from the heavens in a Greek play, takes control of the events and explains every loose end in a persuasive manner. Agatha Christie developed this to a fine art with Poirot and his famous denouncements. However, Daniel overlooked the fact he had moved the setting of 10 Nights from the USA to North Wales, and his superior character was a US senator who seemed to flit easily between Wales and America. That trip took over 5 weeks and cost about $3,500 each way in today's money, as you can see for yourself when you read A Drevlin. Daniel applies this unfortunately mislearnt plotting lesson from Timothy Shea Arthur to A Drevlin. It's amazing how easily people flit to and fro across the Atlantic to satisfy his plot requirements. But this is a trivial criticism compared to his fascinating character-driven approach to the moral dilemmas of life in Victorian mould. As I close this talk, please allow me to point out some of the powerful threads Daniel wove into this series of characters which inhabit his first novel. For a key character, he chooses the Christian name of Ishmael. This was not a common name in North Wales then. From his studies at Bala, Daniel knew that the name was of Hebrew origin and carried the meaning, God will listen. He also knew that Ishmael was Abraham's son by the slave woman Hagar. We can be sure of this because Daniel wrote and preached a sermon about Hagar, and in it he said, Hagar had suffered hardship and survived. Now she feared that Ishmael was about to give up his spirit. She said, I can't look on helpless while my boy is dying. So she sat nearby and lifted up her voice to tell God of her troubles. Hagar had no hope of deliverance. But God does not see like a man. He sees the end from the beginning and saw that the boy, about to die under the tree, would make a great nation. God did not intend him to die. He took pity on the boy's distress and disclosed to Hagar the sight of a hidden well close beside them. The convenience of man is the convenience of God. When he is invoked by his servant from any direction, that is the time that God will come into view. It is worth it for a man to fall into the most dreadful of situations if God comes to him in the end. As we recall, a miner called Ishmael Jones spoke up for the downtrodden miners of Leeswood Green and was condemned to a month's hard labour for his trouble. He was also the focus of a riot which killed Susan Younghusband and 3 others. So the name Ishmael already had tremendous local significance, and Daniel used his imaginary character, Ishmael Price, to investigate the motives and illustrate routes to redemption for the downtrodden Welsh folk of Mold. Daniel is also concerned that his beloved Bethesda Chapel did not appreciate the work of the Reverend Roger Edwards on their behalf. He tells a great moral tale of how an expanding chapel places too great a burden on a voluntary preacher without planning for its future. This character, Mr. Williams, never even gets the detail of a Christian name, as Daniel simply gives him a narrative purpose to die and so force the chapel to seek out a paid pastor. This opens up a whole narrative scenario for the interaction of chapel politics and motivations. It allows Daniel to investigate the claim that Noah Rees, the chosen minister, had been personally called by God to serve. Daniel had hoped to receive such an audience with God himself, but it never happened. The sad closing paragraphs of his 7th sermon tells us that. But here in A Drevlin, he offers 2 detailed imaginings of visitations by the Holy Spirit, one to Noah and the other to the dying elder, Benjamin Price. With the characters of Jim Price and Sian Jones, he shows just how hard life can be for the poorest folk in the town. To reinforce this point, he creates the monstrous character of Jeremiah Jones, who personifies all the faults of landlords who he saw in action during the Mold riots. Daniel doesn't hesitate to spell out the virtues of education and extols the benefits of Sunday school for both children and adults. Ishmael is saved from the evils of drink and becomes a pillar of the chapel because he is given good Sunday school teaching. For me, one of the most amusing subplots is the story of John Aled Jones. This hapless would-be writer agonises over his choice of pseudonym and oozes a degree of pomposity that always exceeds his writing ability. The township is more than a debut effort that is a little rough around the edges. It is a well-crafted series of moral tales, illustrated by composite characters, created by Daniel to share his insights into the human condition and the social forces which batter or enhance their lives. It's a morality fable, set within the context of a real town. It took me 2 years to read Adreflon, as I had first to transcribe an accurate text of the original Welsh dialect that Daniel wrote it in, and then boilerplate the words into modern English. Sadly, it's no longer in print in Welsh, and even if it was, its dated vocabulary doesn't make it an easy read for Welsh learners, or even for quite a few modern Welsh speakers who I consulted about the difficult words. But it is an underappreciated landmark in Welsh literature which has been completely overshadowed by the success of Rhys Lewis. But it remains a showcase for Daniel's progressive thoughts on civic responsibility, his ideas for helping improve society, and a testament to the strength of his much-challenged faith. Translating it had the benefit of forcing me to consider the meaning Daniel intended to convey, and it's left me deeply impressed by his talent for social observation. I hope that my translation will help bring this early example of Daniel's talent to a wider audience. If I had the talent, I'd edit his text into modern Welsh, but that's way beyond my capability. But perhaps my translation might encourage a modern Welsh edit of Daniel's unique work. My name's Robert Lomas. This has been the 2024 Thursday lecture for the Daniel Owen Festival. Thank you for listening.
Well, I did tell you that Robert had a very deep knowledge of Daniel Owen and his times. We've been treated to a vivid picture of Mold and area during Daniel Owen's lifetime and a specific period in Daniel Owen's life, and indeed a deep insight into his thoughts and feelings and the resultant work, which we can now read in English. I know Robert's very willing to take questions. Does anybody have any comments? Trevor, may I call on you to give a formal vote of thanks? Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed.
Wel, gyfeillion, dwi'n ddim amdano chi, ond dwi wedi cael noson wefreiddiol. Mae wedi bod yn gyflwyniad ardderchog. Ac mae'n adlewyrchiad o weithgarwch, caled, ymroddiad. Ynddi? Chi'n teimlo beth dwi'n trio ddeud chi nawr? Right? Sut math o gyflwyniad yn wedi cael fan hyn sy'n dangos ni ymroddiad, ond hefyd brwd frydedd. What I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, is this to me, not about yourselves, is an excellent presentation. But it is a reflection of the hard work, the graft that has gone into preparing such a researched documentation, as it were, of an aspect of Daniel Owen. We've seen in the presentation a lot of effort, we've seen a lot of commitment, but to me, what comes through it all is enthusiasm. Bubbling, isn't it? He wants to tell you more. We haven't finished the story yet, have we? I like it. I like the idea. But dyna ni. Fi'n nawr cael anrhydedd. Yes, I'm having the privilege of anrhydedd o ddiolch yn swyddogol, yn ffurfiol ar ran y pwyllgor a'r gynulleidfa heno. Diolch o galon i chi, Robert, am y cyflwyniad chi. A cofio a iaith ddod gyntaf, excuse me dweud hynny. I'm privileged to offer an official thanks to Robert for all the things we've done about this. But remember, the effort he's put in to make sure which language he presented it first of all. Right? Da iawn, Robert, yn Gymraeg. A it was da iawn. Nawr te, rhowch eich dwylo at ei gilydd i ddiolch o galon.